The morning Della Atwood found the letter tucked beneath the door of her family's mercantile in Cimarron, New Mexico. The year was 1878, and the dry desert wind was already pulling at the corners of everything loose in the world, as though God himself was restless. She had not expected anything extraordinary that Tuesday. She had not expected much of anything at all, truth be told, because expectation had been a luxury she could no longer afford. Her father, Thomas Atwood, had died 7 months prior of a fever that swept through Cimarron like a quiet thief, and the mercantile he had spent 23 years building from nothing more than a canvas tent and a mule cart now rested entirely on Della's shoulders. She was 22 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with the kind of quiet beauty that people noticed only after they had been in her company for a while, because she did not announce herself. She simply existed with a steadiness that drew people in the way a warm fire draws cold hands. The letter was from her father's old business partner in Abilene, a man named Gerald Hooper, and it was not kind. Gerald wanted his share of the investment returned, the sum of $400, within 60 days, or he intended to place a legal claim on the property. Della read the letter twice at the counter, then folded it carefully and set it behind the flour sacks where she stored things she was not ready to deal with, and she got on with the morning. That was Della's way. Not avoidance exactly, but a practical ordering of what could be handled now and what would have to wait its turn. She swept the porch, restocked the dry goods shelves, sold a bolt of calico to Mrs. Portman, and spoke kindly to old Pete Rays, who came in just to get out of the heat and talk about his late wife. By the time the sun was high and the street outside was baking, she had almost convinced herself that the letter was a problem for tomorrow's Della. Then Sheriff Cal Dunn walked in. Cal Dunn was not a bad man. He was a tired one, which was sometimes worse. He had been sheriff of Cimarron for 9 years, and he had the look of a man who had seen enough of people's troubles to develop a certain professional distance from them, the way a doctor learns not to flinch at blood. He set his hat on the counter, accepted the cup of water Della offered, and told her in plain terms that Gerald Hooper had already sent a wire to the county seat and that if she could not produce the money, the mercantile would likely be auctioned within the month. "I'm telling you now so you have time," Cal said. He was not without heart. "There might be men in town willing to help you find a loan, ranchers. This is a decent community, Della. Your father was well liked." "I know he was," Della said. "I'll figure something out." After Cal left, she stood very still for a long time behind the counter, her hands flat on the wood, and she thought about her father. Thomas Atwood had been a gentle, broad man who read his Bible each evening by lamplight, and who had the habit of whispering a prayer before he opened the store each morning. He had taught Della to pray not as a formality, but as a conversation, honest and plain-spoken, the way you would talk to someone who was sitting right there with you. So that evening, after she locked the mercantile and climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment above it, Della knelt beside her bed and she prayed. She prayed for her father's soul. She prayed for wisdom in the matter of Gerald Hooper's $400. And then, without quite knowing why, she thought of a name she had not thought of in years. Isaac Bishop. She had known Isaac Bishop for exactly 1 week, back when she was 16 and he was 18, when both their families had been traveling west on the same wagon train out of Kansas. He had been a tall, quiet young man with dark eyes and the kind of careful hands that suggested he thought before he moved. They had spoken maybe a dozen times. He had helped her when one of the wagon wheels cracked on a rocky crossing, working beside her father in the heat until the wheel was repaired, never once complaining or expecting thanks. On the last night before the wagon train split, his family heading further north toward Colorado and hers turning south toward New Mexico, he had said to her, very simply, that he hoped she found what she was looking for. She had thought about that for weeks afterward, not because it was a romantic declaration. It had not been, but because of the sincerity in it, the way his eyes had been direct and unhurried, as though he meant it the way most people mean the things they never say out loud. 6 years had passed. She had no idea what had become of Isaac Bishop, She did not know if he was alive or dead, married or alone, a rancher or a drifter or something else entirely. She only knew that when the weight of the world pressed down on her that particular evening in her room above the mercantile, his name surfaced in her mind the way certain things surface in water, rising up from the bottom without being called. She added him to her prayer. She asked God to bless Isaac Bishop wherever he was, to keep him well, and to grant him whatever peace the world had not yet given him. It felt like a strange thing to pray for a near stranger, but it felt right, and she had learned to trust the things that felt right in the quiet of her own heart. She had been praying his name for 3 years. She did not know why she kept doing it. It had simply become part of her evening practice, as habitual as the cup of chamomile tea she brewed before sleep, as natural as the window she cracked open to let in the cool night air. Isaac Bishop had become, in some way she could not fully articulate, a fixed point in her inner world, a name she carried without quite knowing what she was carrying it for. She did not know, in those long evening prayers, that somewhere north and east of her, a cowboy was kneeling in the dirt beside a bedroll in whatever camp he had made for the night, or in whatever bunkhouse he was passing through, and saying her name too. Isaac Bishop had not forgotten Della Atwood. He had tried, in the busy way of a working man, in the way you try to forget something that has never fully lodged itself in your conscious mind, but has instead settled quietly into the marrow of you. He had spent the years since that wagon train working cattle drives from Colorado down through Texas and back up again, living the itinerant life of a cowhand, sleeping under more skies than he could count, eating dust and beans and the occasional good meal at a roadhouse on a payday. He was 24 now, lean and weathered for his age, with the broad shoulders that came from years of roping and the quiet eyes that had always been his defining feature. His mother said his eyes were too serious for a young man's face. His trail boss said those same eyes were the reason he trusted Isaac with the night watch. Isaac had grown up on a small Colorado homestead that his father lost to drought and bad luck when Isaac was 19. His parents had eventually settled in Pueblo, and Isaac had gone to work driving cattle because it was honest work and it paid, and because the open land suited something in him that could not abide being enclosed for too long. He was not unhappy with his life. He was simply aware, in the way certain honest men are aware, that something was missing from it. He had prayed for Della Atwood the first time 3 years ago, after a trail drive that had taken him through New Mexico and close enough to Cimarron that he had found himself looking at the town from a distance, dust rising above its buildings in the afternoon heat, wondering. He had not gone into town that day. He had told himself he had no good reason to. He was not the sort of man to track down a girl he had spoken to briefly at 16 on the basis of a feeling he could not even name properly. But that night, he had prayed for her. He had asked God to bless Della Atwood wherever she was, to keep her safe and give her joy, and to forgive him for not being the kind of man who knew what to do with the things he felt. He did not know it was a prayer he would repeat with slight variations for the next 3 years, as faithfully as she was repeating his. The world, however, had no interest in keeping them apart forever. It was a man named Olin Marsh who, without knowing he was doing it, set the whole thing in motion. Olin Marsh was a cattle buyer from Santa Fe, who came through Cimarron in late September of 1878 and stopped at Atwood's mercantile for tobacco and salt. He was a talkative man, and Della was a good listener, and in the course of their conversation he mentioned that he was looking for a reliable forwarding agent in Cimarron, someone who could hold freight and coordinate with incoming drivers, a small but steady commission-paying arrangement. Della's mind moved fast. She had been looking at every possible angle to save the mercantile, and this was a genuine one. She could convert part of the storeroom into a freight holding area easily enough. The commission would not cover the $400 Gerald Hooper wanted, not in 60 days, but it would help, and it would demonstrate to any lender she approached that the business had steady income potential. She shook hands with Olin Marsh, and the arrangement was set. The first cattle drive she was to coordinate with arrived 2 weeks later. It was a smaller operation, 38 head coming up from Texas with a crew of 6, belonging to a rancher named Tate Halford who was selling beef to the army post near Cimarron. The foreman of the drive was to collect some dry goods from the mercantile and drop off a freight package from Halford's business associate in Texas. Della was behind the counter when the bell above the door rang and the foreman walked in. She looked up. Isaac Bishop stood in the doorway of Atwood's mercantile in Cimarron, New Mexico, with trail dust on his coat and his hat in his hand, blinking in the dimness after the bright afternoon sun outside. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was just that she was seeing him as a woman rather than a girl. He had a quality of stillness about him that was immediately recognizable even after 6 years, something in the way he stood that suggested he was never in a hurry to speak before he was ready. He recognized her at the exact moment she recognized him. Neither of them spoke for a full 3 seconds, which was long enough to feel extraordinary. "Della Atwood," Isaac said, and his voice was lower than she remembered, roughed by years of wind and open air, but the tone of it was the same. Careful, direct. "Isaac Bishop," she said, and she was proud of how steady her own voice was because her heart had gone entirely unreliable. He came to the counter. She pulled out Olin Marsh's ledger, and they went through the business of the freight exchange with a thoroughness that was partly professional and partly, she suspected, the mutual need to do something with their hands while their minds caught up to the situation. "I did not know you were in Cimarron," he said when the business part was settled. 6 years, she said. "My father brought us here in '72. How is your father?" She paused just briefly. "He passed this past spring." Something moved across Isaac's face that was not just polite sympathy. "I am sorry to hear that," he said. "He was a good man, I remember that." "He was the best man I knew," Della said simply, and that was the full truth of it. Isaac turned his hat slowly in his hands. "You are running the store yourself now." "I am," she said. He looked around the mercantile with the careful attention he gave to everything, taking in the neat shelves, the swept floor, the organized counter, and she could see him filing it away, building his picture of who she had become. "It suits you," he said. "You were always good at managing things. I remember you reorganizing the wagon supplies on the train and nobody asking you to, and after you did it, everyone could find everything in half the time." She laughed, genuinely startled. "I had forgotten about that." "I hadn't," he said, and the simplicity of it landed like something heavy and quiet. He needed to get back to the drive. He said so with clear reluctance, settling his hat on his head and picking up the packaged goods, but at the door he turned. "How long is the drive stopping here?" "According to the schedule Mr. Marsh gave me, 2 days for rest and resupply," Della said. He nodded slowly. "Then maybe I will come back tomorrow, if that is all right." "The store is open every day but Sunday," she said. A small smile crossed his face. It transformed him entirely, that smile, opening something up in his expression that his habitual gravity kept closed. "I'll come before Sunday then," he said, and stepped out into the bright afternoon. Della stood very still for a moment after the door closed. Then she sat down on the stool behind the counter, pressed both hands to her cheeks, and tried to compose herself in the manner of a sensible adult woman. She was not entirely successful. He came back the next morning, earlier than she had expected, and he did not pretend the visit was about anything commercial. He brought a small paper bag of boiled sweets he had bought from a Mexican vendor in the street, which struck her as such an unexpectedly thoughtful gesture that she had to busy herself with the coffee pot so he would not see her expression. They sat on opposite sides of the counter, and they talked for 2 hours. The kind of talking that catches fire easily and burns clean, where neither person has to work to find the next thing to say because everything connects to something else, and time moves strangely. He told her about the cattle drives, about the particular quality of the sky in different parts of the country, about a winter he had spent in a line camp in Colorado that had been one of the loneliest and also one of the most clarifying experiences of his life. She told him about learning to run the mercantile, about the joy of knowing every person in town by name, about her father's habit of reading aloud from the newspaper each evening, about the way the desert changed colors in the evening light in ways she had never been able to adequately describe to anyone from somewhere else. He listened to her the way she had noticed he listened on the wagon train, with his full attention and no impatience, as though whatever she was saying was the most important information currently available. "You have built something real here," he said, when she had finished describing the mercantile's operation. "Something that matters." "I may lose it," she said, and then was surprised she had said it because she had not planned to. But there was something in the way he had spoken that made the truth feel safe. She told him about Gerald Hooper and the $400. She told him about the 60-day window and the conversation with Sheriff Dunn, and the arrangement with Olin Marsh that was good but not good enough, not fast enough. She told him plainly, without drama or self-pity, the way she discussed most hard things. When she finished, Isaac was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking, not that he was uncertain. "Would you be willing to let me help?" he said. She looked at him. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I have wages saved. I have been on drives for 5 years and I have no household expenses worth speaking of. I'm not talking about charity, Della. I'm talking about a loan between people who know each other, with terms you set and a ledger entry we both sign." She felt something shift in her chest, some arrangement of pride and gratitude and something warmer that she could not yet name. "That is a considerable offer to make to someone you spent a week with 6 years ago," she said carefully. He met her eyes without flinching. "It is," he agreed. "I know what I'm offering." She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything serious, turning it around to look at all its angles. It was practical. It was fair. He had framed it well, loan not charity, terms she controlled. And the truth was that without some external help, the mercantile was almost certainly lost. "I will think about it tonight," she said, "and give you my answer tomorrow." He nodded, accepting this without pressure, and finished his coffee and went back to the drive. That evening, kneeling beside her bed as she did every evening, Della prayed. She thanked God, somewhat breathlessly, for what she could only describe as the most unexpected thing that had ever happened to her on an otherwise unremarkable October morning. She prayed for guidance about Isaac's offer. And then she prayed his name, as she had done for 3 years. Only this time it was different. This time there was a face and a voice and the smell of trail dust and the memory of a small paper bag of boiled sweets. And the prayer felt different, heavier and warmer, like something that had finally been allowed to become what it always was. The next morning she accepted his offer. They sat together at the counter, and she wrote out the terms herself, careful and precise. $350, which was what she could reasonably calculate she needed above what she already had, to be repaid within 2 years at a modest interest that she insisted on because accepting interest-free money from a man she barely knew crossed a line she would not cross. Isaac looked at the terms, agreed to all of them without negotiating, and they both signed the ledger page. "The drive leaves tomorrow morning," he said, folding his copy of the terms and tucking it inside his coat. "I know," she said. "I would like to write to you," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made clear he was not asking about friendly correspondence. He was asking something larger than that, carefully and without pressure, leaving the door entirely in her hands to open or close. She held his gaze for a moment. "I would like that," she said. He reached across the counter and shook her hand, because they were still in that in-between place where neither of them was quite sure how to be, and the handshake was both too formal and somehow perfect. His hand was warm and his grip was careful, and when he let go, she felt the absence of it more than she had expected to. He was gone with the drive the next morning before the sun was fully up. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, postmarked from a town 40 miles south where the drive had been held for sorting. It was not a long letter, but it was dense in the way his conversation had been dense, specific and considered, without empty filler. He told her about the remainder of the drive, a brief incident at a river crossing that he described with dry humor, the state of the cattle market, and the color of the sky above the southern plains in late October. At the end, almost as though he had added it as an afterthought but she knew he had not, he wrote, "I think about Cimarron more than I thought I would. I think about the mercantile on the main street. I hope the accounts are balancing." She read that last sentence 4 times. She wrote back the same evening, a longer letter than she had planned, because once she started she found she had more to say than she had realized. She told him the accounts were indeed balancing, that she had paid Gerald Hooper his $400 in full and had the receipt, that the Hooper business was concluded and she was sleeping better for it. She told him about the first frost that had come to Cimarron that week, the way the mountains looked with a thin coat of white on their upper ridges. She told him about Pete Ray's, who had finally stopped coming in just to sit and talk, not because he was dead, she was quick to clarify, but because Mrs. Portman's widowed sister had arrived in town, and Pete had discovered an unexpected interest in purchasing ribbon and buttons. She was pleased with that last part. She wanted to make him smile. He did smile, alone in a bunkhouse on a ranch outside of Las Cruces, reading her letter by the light of a single oil lamp, while the other hands were playing cards across the room. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket, against his chest, and went to sleep earlier than usual, and his sleep was better than it had been in months. The letters became regular after that. Every 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes more often when one of them had something particularly worth saying. They covered an enormous amount of ground in those letters, the kind of ground that 2 people cover when they are honest and they are curious about each other and neither of them is pretending. They talked about their families, their fears, their memories, their beliefs. Isaac told her about his father's failed homestead, the way that loss had shaped him, made him skeptical of putting down roots too early. Della told him about the loneliness of the months after her father died, the way a familiar place could become strange when the person who made it home was gone. In February of 1879, Isaac wrote that he had taken a position as lead hand on a ranch outside of Taos, which was not so far from Cimarron, and that he intended to see it through to spring, and then perhaps reconsider his situation. Della read that letter on a cold morning with her breath misting in the air of the mercantile before she got the stove going, and she had to be very deliberately calm about it, very measured, because the word reconsider was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and she did not want to build something too large on a single word. She wrote back, "Taos is not so far at all." He arrived in Cimarron on the 2nd Saturday of March, 1879. She had not known exactly when he was coming. He had written that he planned to visit in March but had not specified a date, and March was a long month. She had told herself she would not spend the whole month watching the door, and she had mostly succeeded at this for the first week and a half, and then had largely failed at it for the last 4 days. He came in the afternoon, when the light was that particular shade of early spring gold that turns everything warm. She heard the bell above the door and looked up from the ledger she was entering, and there he was. He had not come in trail dust this time. He was clean, his coat brushed, his dark hair combed. He was still wearing the working clothes of a cowhand because they were what he owned, and he was not a man who put on airs, but he had made an effort, and she noticed it. "Hello, Della," he said. "Hello, Isaac," she said. He came to the counter and she poured him coffee without being asked because she had been thinking for 2 weeks about pouring him coffee, and they smiled at each other across the counter with a warmth that had nowhere left to hide. "I told the foreman at Taos I would not be returning for the summer," he said. She set the coffee pot down. "Did you?" "I did." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I thought I might look at what is available in this part of the territory." "For work?" she asked, keeping her voice even. He looked at her directly with those serious dark eyes. "For a number of things," he said. She held his gaze. The Garrity Ranch, about 4 miles east of town, has been looking for a lead hand since January, she said. Ben Garrity is a fair employer. I hear it from his hands when they come in for supplies. That is good to know, Isaac said. And the town is a pleasant one, she added. Good people. The church on Elm Street has a fine minister. The community picnic in June is something people look forward to all year. Is that so? He said, and he was smiling now, that transforming smile. And the mercantile, she said with great care, does a fairly steady business, and the proprietor is generally considered to be tolerable company. Tolerable, he repeated. I may have understated it, she allowed. They looked at each other across the counter in the afternoon light, and what was between them had been building since the day he walked through that door in October, had been building in every letter and every careful, honest word, and it did not need much more encouragement than that. I would very much like to come to the June picnic, Isaac said, if the invitation is available. It is, Della said. Very much available. He rode out to the Garrity Ranch the following Monday, and came back on Tuesday with a handshake agreement and a starting date. Ben Garrity, who was 52 and had been ranching outside of Cimarron for 15 years and knew excellent horsemanship and work ethic when he saw it, hired Isaac Bishop without much deliberation. The months that followed were the happiest Della could remember in a long time. Isaac came to town on Saturdays, which was his half-day off. He came to the mercantile first always, and they would sit together over coffee for an hour or two and talk, and then he would help her with whatever needed doing, hauling freight boxes or repairing the front porch step that had been soft for a month, and she would pretend she was not completely at peace in a way she had not been in years. Then they would often walk in the evening, through the streets of Cimarron as the day cooled, talking still, or sometimes just walking in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them, the kind of quiet you can only have with someone you trust entirely. In April he brought her wildflowers he had picked along the road from the ranch, tucked into his saddlebag, somewhat crushed but still beautiful, and presented them to her without ceremony, the way he did most things, straightforward and without performance. She put them in a jar of water on the counter, and every customer that day asked about them, and she said, with a composure she was proud of, that a friend had brought them. That evening she wrote the word "friend" in her journal, and looked at it for a long time, and then crossed it out and wrote nothing else on that page. In May, he met her at church, which had not been planned but which she discovered she had hoped for when she looked up from the pew and saw him settling into the row behind her, nodding to her with the gravity that was his default expression. And she nodded back and turned forward again, and spent a good portion of the minister's sermon being aware of exactly where Isaac Bishop was sitting relative to where she was sitting. Afterward they walked together to the bakery on the main street, which sold fresh bread on Sunday mornings, and they ate warm bread with butter while leaning against the outside wall in the early summer warmth. And Della thought that if you had asked her a year ago to picture perfect contentment, she would not have imagined anything as simple as this. The June picnic happened on a Saturday, which was Isaac's usual half-day. He arrived at the mercantile in the morning, as always, but he had his good shirt on under his coat, and his boots were polished, and he offered her his arm when they walked to the town common where the picnic was laid out under the cottonwood trees, and she took it. And the women of Cimarron, who had been watching this development with considerable interest since March, exchanged looks of satisfaction. There were long tables of food, and children running in the grass, and someone with a fiddle started playing in the afternoon, and several couples danced. Isaac did not dance, a fact he disclosed to her with some gravity as though confessing a significant deficiency. "Can you not or will you not?" she asked. "Both honestly," he said. "The first leading to the second," she laughed. "I'll teach you sometime." "You'll regret that offer," he said. "I don't think I will," she said. He looked at her, and in the warm afternoon light with the fiddle playing and the smell of summer grass and her hand still resting in the crook of his arm, he said quietly so that only she could hear, "Della, I would like to speak plainly." "You always speak plainly," she said. "It's one of the things I most appreciate about you. Then you know what I am about to say." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I do," she said, just as quietly. "I came to Cimarron because of the proximity to Taos and because Ben Garrity is a good employer," Isaac said. "And I told myself those were the reasons for about 2 weeks, and then I stopped telling myself that because it was not honest and I am trying to be an honest man." "You came here because of me," Della said. "I came here because of you," he agreed. He turned to face her more fully, his expression as serious and direct as always, but with something unguarded in it now, something that had been there all along and was finally, simply, allowed to be seen. "I am not a man of large means. I have a job and savings and the capacity to build something if I work at it, which I intend to do. I don't know yet what that will look like, but I know that whatever it looks like, I want it to include you, if you are willing." Della looked at him for a long moment. The fiddle was playing something gentle and the shadows of the cottonwood leaves moved across the grass at their feet. "Isaac," she said, "I have been willing since October." Something in his face changed completely, that gravity lifting like a window thrown open. He took her hand from his arm and held it properly, both his hands around hers, warm and steady. "Then we are agreed," he said. "We are very much agreed," she said. He kissed her hand, which was perhaps a more formal gesture than the moment called for and absolutely perfect for the kind of man he was, and she squeezed his fingers. And across the picnic ground, Mrs. Portman said something to Pete Reyes, and Pete Reyes nodded with considerable satisfaction. That evening, alone in her room above the mercantile, Della Atwood knelt beside her bed as she did every evening. Her prayers were different now. Not smaller, not less sincere, but different in the way that all things are different when what you have been hoping for has finally arrived, and you are looking at it clearly rather than reaching for it in the dark. She prayed in gratitude. She prayed for Isaac Bishop by name, as she had for 3 years, only now she was not praying for an unknown man in an unknown place. She was praying for a man 4 miles away who had held her hand at the picnic and whose serious dark eyes were, she now understood without question, the eyes she wanted to look at for the rest of her life. Isaac, at that same hour, was in his small room in the bunkhouse at the Garrity Ranch. The other hands were asleep or nearly so, and the room was dark except for the faint blue light of a clear night coming through the small window. He knelt on the bare board floor, as he did most evenings, a habit from his mother's house that he had never lost even across all the bunkhouses and camps of the past 5 years. He prayed, as he always did, for Della Atwood. Only this time, at the end of the prayer, he added, "Thank you." July passed in a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat, though that was considerable. Isaac and Della saw each other every Saturday and frequently in the week as well, because the Garrity Ranch needed supplies regularly enough that Ben Garrity sometimes sent Isaac into town on a Tuesday or Thursday. Ben Garrity was not, Della suspected, entirely unaware of this arrangement's secondary benefits for Isaac, and she thought well of the man for it. They walked. They talked. He brought her things he noticed and thought she would like: an interesting rock from the riverbed with blue mineral running through it, a small carved horse he had bought from an Apache craftsman passing through, a jar of honey from a beekeeper near the ranch. She gave him books from the small collection on the mercantile's shelf, knowing what he would find interesting, and he always read them and came back with something specific to say about them. In August, there was a difficulty that shook the quiet of the summer. A man named Cutter Voss, who had worked the Garrity Ranch in the winter and left badly, came back to Cimarron with a grievance and expressed it loudly and with some aggression in the saloon on a Friday evening. Isaac had been in town, having ridden in after the day's work to have supper with Della, which had become a Thursday evening tradition. He had walked past the saloon on his way back to his horse, and Cutter Voss had come out the door at the wrong moment, recognized Isaac from the ranch, and decided, with the logic of a man several drinks into his anger, that Isaac was a convenient target for all his frustrations. The confrontation was brief and ugly. Voss threw a punch that Isaac stepped back from, and then Isaac, who was not a man given to violence but who was also not one to allow himself to be struck without response, hit Voss once precisely, and Voss sat down hard in the street and stayed there. Sheriff Dunn appeared within 2 minutes, as he generally did when there was noise outside the saloon, and sorted the matter. Voss was held overnight and Dunn took Isaac's account, which was straightforward, and that was essentially that. Della had heard the commotion from the mercantile's second-floor window, and by the time she had come downstairs and out to the street, it was over. She saw Isaac in the lamplight outside the saloon, talking to Cal Dunn, his jaw set with the controlled expression of a man managing his own anger very carefully. She waited at the edge of the street until the conversation with Dunn was concluded, and when Isaac walked toward her she said nothing at first, just looked at him to assess. "I am fine," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Come inside." She cleaned a small cut on his hand where Voss's belt buckle had caught him during the scuffle, which was the sum total of his injuries, and while she did this they were both quiet, not the comfortable quiet of their walks but the more charged quiet of a thing that had happened and needed to be integrated. "Does this occur often?" she asked. "Not often," he said. "Less than it used to on the drives. You meet more difficult men on a drive. And you handled it well. Adequately," he said. "I would have preferred not to handle it at all." She finished with his hand and held it for a moment, just to settle something in herself. He turned his hand under hers and held it back, gently. "I do not look for trouble," he said. "I know you don't," she said. "I know exactly what kind of man you are, Isaac. I have been paying attention." He looked at her and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. "I know you have," he said. "I feel it." Cutter Voss left town the next morning and was not seen in Cimarron again. September brought the first real conversations about the future. Not hints and careful implications, but direct, practical conversations of the kind that two serious people have when they are done being careful and are ready to build. They were sitting on the mercantile's back porch in the early evening, looking out at the hills going golden in the late light, when Isaac said, "Ben Garrity has offered me a share arrangement." Della turned to look at him. "What kind of share?" "He wants to expand the herd in the spring, and he needs a man he can trust with the operation," Isaac said. "He is offering a small ownership stake in exchange for a 3-year commitment as full ranch manager. It's not large, but it grows. In 3 years it becomes a meaningful thing." "That is a serious offer," Della said. "It is," he agreed. "And it means staying in Cimarron." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the hills. "Is that a concern?" "It is the opposite of a concern," he said. He was looking at her, not the hills. "I want to stay in Cimarron. I want to build something here. I want very much to build something here with you if you'll have me." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Della, not as a formality or because it's the expected thing, because I cannot imagine the next 30 years without you in them, and I do not want to try." The hills were gold and rose in the fading light. A crow called somewhere. The evening smelled like juniper and warm earth. "Yes," Della said. "Obviously yes. Isaac, I have been in love with you since February." He reached for her hand. "February," he said, almost to himself, as though marking it. "One of your letters about the Taos sky," she said. "It was a very good letter." "I wrote that letter 4 times," he said, "trying to get it right." "You got it right," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her, there on the back porch of her father's mercantile in the September evening, and it was simple and certain and absolutely right, the way the ending of a long search feels when you are finally where you were going. They were married in November of 1879, in the church on Elm Street, where she had sat in front of him that morning in May. The minister was the same good man she had been listening to for 3 years. And the town of Cimarron turned out in the way small towns do for the weddings of people they are fond of, which is to say generously and with enthusiasm. Della wore her mother's dress, which she had altered herself, white cotton with small embroidered details at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers because the fresh ones were long gone with the season, and she thought of the crushed flowers Isaac had brought her in April and smiled as she walked down the aisle. Isaac stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had bought in Santa Fe, which fit him well and which he wore with the upright posture of a man who was fully present in this moment. And when she reached him and he turned to look at her, his expression was everything. No performance, no careful control. Just completely open, completely there. They said their vows in steady voices, both of them, the way they did everything, plainly and without drama, meaning every word. After, in the churchyard, with the November sky blue and cold above them and their friends around them, Pete Reyes shook Isaac's hand so hard it should have hurt and told him to take care of that girl. And Isaac said he intended to. And Mrs. Portman cried in the happy way that Mrs. Portman cried at everything. And Ben Garrity slapped Isaac on the back and told Della she had made a wise choice, which she already knew. The weeks after the wedding were full and warm. Isaac moved into the apartment above the mercantile, which was small but which they arranged together with the practical pleasure of two capable people combining their lives, making room, figuring out what went where, negotiating with good humor the minor questions of domestic arrangement. He was a tidy man, which she had expected, and she was organized to a degree that sometimes astonished him, and together they were a household that ran well, that worked in the mornings with the economy of motion that comes from two people who understand each other and do not waste each other's time. He rode out to the Garrity ranch each weekday and she ran the mercantile, and each evening he came home, which was the best word she knew for what the apartment had become, and they ate supper together and talked and sometimes read, and in those evenings she experienced a deep, quiet joy that she had not known she was capable of until she was in it. In February of 1880, she told him she was expecting their first child. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, eating the morning's second cup of coffee before riding out, and he looked at her over the rim of the cup and set it down very carefully and stood up and came to where she was standing and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression she had no adequate words for. "When?" he said. "August, I think," she said. "Maybe late July." He kissed her forehead. He kissed her properly. He sat back down and picked up his coffee and then put it down again and stood up again, as though he could not quite locate the right response to the size of what he was feeling. "Are you well?" he said. "Very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings." "Happy? Happy," he repeated, as though testing the word. Then, "So am I enormously." The spring of 1880 was a beautiful one in Cimarron. Isaac threw himself into the ranch work with the added energy of a man building for something specific, negotiating with Ben Garrity to accelerate some aspects of the share arrangement. Ben, who had sons but no one with Isaac's particular combination of drive and reliability, was accommodating. He liked Isaac Bishop. Most people did once they knew him, because there was nothing hidden in him and nothing wasted. Della ran the mercantile through June, by which point her condition was obvious, and she had stopped pretending it was possible to be inconspicuous, and the women of Cimarron descended upon her with advice and practical assistance in the way women of small towns have always done, which she accepted with gratitude and navigated with her characteristic organized efficiency. In the first week of August, a boy was born. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, and the labor was long but not dangerous, and when it was over and the midwife placed the baby in Isaac's arms, Isaac stood very still with the baby against his chest and looked at Della in the bed, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because neither of them had words for it. "He is perfect," Isaac finally said, and his voice was different, quiet in a new way. "He looks like you," Della said. "God help him," Isaac said, and she laughed, which hurt, and he carried their son carefully across the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her. They named him Thomas for her father. Thomas Bishop grew in the way healthy babies grow, noisily and with great determination. He had Isaac's dark eyes and Della's brown hair, and the personality of someone who had decided very early that the world was an interesting place, and he intended to investigate all of it immediately. He slept poorly in the first months, which meant neither of his parents slept well either. But they managed it with the cooperative competence that was the foundation of their marriage, trading shifts and supporting each other without complaint, though sometimes with a humor that helped. Isaac, holding Thomas at 2 in the morning in the kitchen so Della could sleep, rocking the boy slowly and murmuring to him in the particular low voice he had found worked better than anything else, thought that he had not imagined, back in those years of drives and bunkhouses and open sky, that he could want to be exactly where he was this much. He thought about the years of praying for Della Atwood and not knowing that she was doing the same for him, and the peculiarity of that, the mystery of how two people can be held in each other's prayers without knowing, kept in each other's hearts across distance and time, until the world finally brought them together. He had told her about it in the early months of their marriage. He had told her, one evening by the lamp, that he had prayed for her every night for 3 years before he walked back into her life through the door of the mercantile in October. He had not planned to tell her. It had come out during a conversation about prayer in general, about what he believed, and he had found he could not talk honestly about that without telling her this. She had been very quiet for a moment after he said it. Then she said, "I was doing the same." He looked at her. "Every night," she said. "For 3 years I prayed your name. I did not know why. It felt right." They had looked at each other in the lamp light of the apartment above the mercantile, and something had settled between them, something large and deep and without adequate words, the recognition of a thing that was larger than either of them, the mystery of how prayer works and what it builds in the dark without our knowing. "We were keeping each other," Della said softly. "We were keeping each other," Isaac agreed. The mercantile continued to thrive through 1880 and into 1881. The freight arrangement with Olin Marsh had become a significant part of the business, and Della had expanded it, adding 2 more buyers from the territory as clients. And the Atwood Mercantile, which was still called the Atwood Mercantile, because the name was part of what made it trusted, had become something her father would have been proud of. There was one afternoon, in the fall of 1881, when a Jicarilla Apache man came into the mercantile with a woman and 2 children. He spoke some English and traded in the area, and had traded with Della's father, and Della knew him by sight as a fair-dealing man named Tall Horse. His family needed supplies, blankets and salt and dried corn, and they did not have money but had pelts to trade, excellent ones. Della made the trade with Tall Horse at a fair exchange, and spoke to him with the same directness and respect she extended to all her customers, because her father had taught her that respect was not conditional on a person's origin or circumstance, and because she had seen with her own eyes what was being done to the Apache in the territory, and she did not contribute to it if she had any choice. Tall Horse said, before he left, that the Atwood store was a fair store, and that he would send others of his band when they needed supplies. This he delivered with the formal deliberateness of a man who does not make statements lightly, and Della received it the same way. Isaac, who had come in that afternoon to check on Thomas, who was with Della in the store while a neighbor's girl helped with the boy, had watched this exchange and said afterward, quietly, that he had seen the way many traders dealt with the Apache and he was proud of her. "It's the right thing," she said simply. "Most people manage to convince themselves the right thing is whatever is convenient," he said. "My father did not bring me up that way," she said. He kissed her temple. Thomas, sitting on the floor with a wooden spoon he had stolen from somewhere, regarded this display with the absolute concentration of a 14-month-old encountering most things. The years that followed built one upon another in the good, solid way of a life that is working as it should. Isaac's partnership with Ben Garrity deepened, and by 1882 he had earned a 10% stake in the ranch, which was not enormous but was real and growing, and the ranch itself was doing well, the herd expanding, the operation tightening under Isaac's management. He was respected in the ranching community in the way that competent, honest men who keep their word tend to be respected, without fanfare but thoroughly. In the summer of 1882, Della became pregnant with their second child. She told Isaac on a Sunday morning, on the back porch where he had proposed to her 3 years before. The hills were summer-burned and brown, and the sky was that particular blue of a New Mexico summer that she had tried to describe in letters and still could never quite capture. "Are you well?" he said, exactly as he had said it the first time. "Extremely," she said. "Isaac, you ask me that every time I tell you anything significant." "I ask it because it is the thing I most need to know," he said. She smiled. "I am very well and very happy, and I would like a girl this time if the subject is open for opinion." "I will see what I can do," he said gravely, and she laughed. The baby arrived in March of 1883, a girl born in the same room as Thomas had been, with the same midwife and the same March cold outside the windows. They named her Clara, for Isaac's mother, which made his mother cry when she received the letter. A long, happy cry that she reported in her response with the kind of self-aware humor that Della understood was where Isaac had gotten some of his own. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, inspected his sister with the suspicious thoroughness of a person who has not been consulted about a major change and is reserving judgment. Within a week, he had decided she was acceptable. Clara had Della's eyes and Isaac's coloring, and a temperament that split the difference, steady like her father and quietly determined like her mother. The 5 of them, Thomas and Clara growing as the years turned, Della and Isaac building and tending and loving, lived the full life of people who have found what they were looking for and are wise enough to know it and grateful enough to say so. The loan from Isaac's savings, which had started the whole thing, was repaid in full by 1881, ahead of the agreed schedule, with the interest Della had insisted on. She presented him with the final payment over supper one evening, the signed ledger page folded with a ribbon around it, and he accepted it with the small smile that she never got tired of seeing and put the ledger page away in the box where he kept important papers. "We are square," she said. "We were never in debt to each other," he said. "Not in any way that counts." "The ledger says otherwise," she said. "The ledger is only counting money," he said. She took his hand across the table. "You're going philosophical on me." "It happens occasionally," he said. "I like it when it does," she said. By 1884, the Atwood mercantile was one of the most established businesses in Cimarron, well known in the wider region for fair dealing and reliable freight services. Della had taken on a young woman named Rosamond as a full-time helper, which freed up more of her own time for the management and accounts side, at which she was exceptionally skilled. The business her father had started in a canvas tent had become something solid and lasting, and she felt his presence in it every day, not as grief but as legacy, as pride. Isaac, by 1884, managed the Garrity operation with a degree of autonomy that made it in practical terms partly his own, and Ben Garrity, who was aging and whose sons had gone to other pursuits, was talking seriously about a larger share transfer within the next few years. Isaac approached this possibility the way he approached everything, with clear-eyed calculation and no wishful thinking, but the picture he was building in his mind was a good one. One evening in the fall of 1884, after Thomas and Clara were asleep, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of settled evening quiet that Della had come to love more than any other sound, she and Isaac sat together on the back porch in their coats, watching the last light leave the hills. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way of someone who is actually thinking about the question rather than producing a quick answer. "I am thinking," he said, "about a wagon train I was on when I was 18 years old." She turned to look at him. "There was a girl," he said. She reorganized the wagon supplies without being asked, and after that everyone could find everything. She was 16, and she had the most competent hands I had ever seen on someone that age. Della was smiling. "Is that all?" "No," he said. "She had a quality about her that I could not name then and have not been able to name properly since. It was not just prettiness, though she was pretty. It was the way she moved through the world, like she was genuinely paying attention to all of it. Like it all mattered to her, really mattered, not as a performance. "That is a very kind description," Della said softly. "It is an accurate one," he said. He looked at her in the failing light. "I thought about you all the way from that wagon train to here. I thought about you on 100 nights when I had no good reason to. I do not understand the mechanism of it, but I am grateful for it." "As am I," she said, "for my side of it. We were such strangers," he said. "And now we are the opposite of strangers," she said. "We are," he agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the hills went dark, and the stars came out above Cimarron in their great numbers, the full wild spread of them that you could only truly see far from cities, and they sat together under them for a long time, not saying much, in the best possible kind of quiet. The world around them was not always simple. The territory of New Mexico in the 1880s was a place of genuine hardship for many people, and Della and Isaac were not insulated from the difficulty of the times by their personal happiness. The cattle industry had its bad seasons, and 1885 brought a drought that tested every ranch in the region. Isaac worked that year with a focused grimness that Della watched with concern and respect both, knowing that the Garrity operation was under real pressure. He came home some evenings that summer looking drawn and tired in a way she had not seen before, dusk dark and quiet in a heavier way than his usual quietness. She did not offer solutions she did not have. What she did was make sure there was a good supper, and that Thomas and Clara were washed and ready for bed by the time he arrived, so that the evenings could be gentle. And she sat with him on the porch after and let him talk when he wanted to talk and be quiet when that was what he needed. And she prayed for him each night with the same faithful regularity she had prayed his name into the dark for years before she ever found him again. The drought broke in September and the fall was better, and Isaac emerged from that year harder tested and more capable, and Ben Garrity, who had watched him manage the crisis with steady hands and clear judgment, accelerated the share transfer conversation significantly. By the end of 1885, Isaac Bishop held a 20% stake in the Garrity Ranch, and the path to full partnership was clear. Thomas started at the town school in 1886, and the sight of her serious-eyed boy in his first day of school clothes, looking exactly like his father with his chin up and his expression settled, made Della stand in the street outside the schoolhouse for a long moment after he went in, pressing her hand flat against her sternum to hold the feeling in. Isaac was home for it, which she was grateful for because it was one of those ordinary, extraordinary moments that you want to share with the right person. "He'll be fine," Isaac said beside her. "I know," she said. "It's not worry, it's something else." "Pride," he said. "Yes," she said. "That." He took her hand and they walked back to the mercantile together in the morning light. Clara, 3 years old, held Isaac's other hand and talked continuously about a cat she had seen near the livery stable that morning and whether it might be persuaded to come home with them. Isaac engaged with this question with complete seriousness, listing the practical considerations on both sides, and Clara listened intently and then said that she thought the cat would decide yes. "She may be right," Della said. "She usually is," Isaac agreed. There did eventually come a cat, a gray one that Thomas named General and Clara simply called Cat, and it lived in the apartment above the mercantile and was of extremely high personal opinion about its own position in the household, and everyone loved it. In 1887, Ben Garrity sat down with Isaac at the kitchen table of the ranch house and laid out a proposition that neither of them had expected to come quite this soon. Ben was 60 years old and his heart had given him some trouble that summer, not a serious episode, but a warning he was too sensible to ignore. He wanted to transfer the greater part of the ranch operations to Isaac, retaining a smaller percentage for himself and his sons as income, with Isaac holding the majority stake and management responsibility. It took 3 evenings of careful discussion to settle the terms. Isaac brought the proposed agreement home and went over it with Della, who read every word and asked sharp questions and helped him think through every implication. Because she was the best financial mind he knew, and he had understood this since the morning he read her careful loan terms in October of 1878. The deal was concluded in November of 1887. Isaac Bishop, who had arrived in Cimarron 9 years earlier as the lead hand of a cattle drive, with nothing much to his name beyond wages and a set of honest principles, became the majority owner and operator of what was now formally called the Bishop Garrity Ranch. Della heard the news from his own mouth when he came home that evening, and she stood in the kitchen of the apartment that was already too small for them and their 2 children and their high-opinion cat, and she looked at her husband in the lamplight, and she thought about a boy of 18 who had helped repair a wagon wheel in the heat without complaint, and she felt the weight of all the years between that moment and this one, and she put her arms around him and held on with a fierceness that surprised them both. "We did it," she said. "You helped," he said into her hair. "You did the work," she said. "You gave me something to work for," he said. They stood like that for a long moment in the kitchen, while downstairs the cat probably knocked something off a shelf, and upstairs Thomas was certainly still awake reading by candlelight when he was supposed to be sleeping, and Clara had probably got into Della's button tin again. The ordinary, extraordinary weight of a life being exactly what you hoped it would be. They began building their house the following spring, on a piece of land a mile from the ranch, a good piece of ground with a view of the mountains that Isaac had purchased from a neighbor who was moving east. It was a real house, not large but well made, with a proper parlor and 3 bedrooms, and a kitchen with a good range and a back porch from which you could see, on clear evenings, the mountains turning purple and gold as the light left them. Isaac worked with the builders on his off hours, side by side with the carpenters, because he was that kind of man, the kind who needs to put his own hands to things that matter. And Della visited the site every Saturday with Thomas and Clara, and the children ran in the unfinished rooms and shouted to hear the echoes, and she stood in the empty kitchen looking at where the range would be, and allowed herself the full luxury of imagining the life that would be lived in this space. They moved in the fall of 1888. It was October, which Della noted with quiet pleasure was the same month Isaac had walked through the door of the mercantile 10 years earlier, covered in trail dust, hat in his hand. She told him this on their first evening in the house, sitting on the back porch together as had always been their way, the mountains before them in the deepening blue of evening. 10 years since October, he said. Exactly. He considered this with the thoughtful attention he gave to things worth keeping. We wasted no time then. We wasted some, she said, 6 years before October. We were young, he said. We were not ready. Maybe not, she allowed. I still think about those 6 years sometimes. What do you think about them? She looked at the mountains. I think about the fact that we were praying for each other through all of them, neither of us knowing. It makes me think that being not ready is not the same as being apart. We were always somewhere in each other's lives, just not the visible part of them. He was quiet for a moment. That is a good way to understand it, he said. I thought so, she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had done 10 years ago in the churchyard, the way he did in the evenings on the porch, the way she expected he would continue to do for the rest of their lives, and she was glad of it every time. Thomas was 9 and Clara was 6, and they had settled into the new house with the adaptability of children who have been raised in security, making it their own with the speed that children manage. Thomas claimed the room with the best window for stargazing, and spent the evenings with a book of astronomical charts that Isaac had found in Santa Fe, trying to name the constellations. Clara organized her collection of rocks and dried flowers and cat-related observations into a system that made sense only to her, but which she was fully prepared to defend. The mercantile, which Della continued to run, was permanently in the family's life as a going concern. She had made clear when the house was being planned that she had no intention of giving up the business her father had built, and Isaac had understood this without it needing to be a negotiation. It was part of who she was, as the ranch was part of who he was, and a marriage between two capable people with separate domains of excellence was something that worked, as theirs had always worked, by mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's worlds. In 1889, New Mexico was still a territory, not yet a state, a distinction that mattered in practical terms because it meant certain legal and civic questions remained unresolved in ways that affected daily life. Isaac had strong feelings about civic responsibility and had served on the town council since 1886. He was not a political man in the speechifying sense, but he was a consistent one, showing up to meetings and saying what he thought and doing the dull, reliable work of a community member, which was what actual civic life mostly required. There was a meeting in the spring of 1889 about a proposed land ordinance that would have, in effect, pushed several Apache families who had been farming land outside of town off their ground on a legal technicality. Isaac spoke against it at the council meeting in plain terms, and he was not the only voice against it, and Della supported the same position in the more quiet way. She supported most positions, by speaking to people she knew and making her own view clear, and by providing fair credit and trading terms to the affected families at the mercantile when others were not. The ordinance failed, which was not a complete resolution of the deeper injustices that framed the era, because those were not resolved in a single council vote in a small New Mexico town, but it was the right thing done in the right direction. And both Della and Isaac believed that the right things done consistently in the right direction were how change actually moved in the world. Late in 1889, Thomas announced with great seriousness at the supper table one evening that he intended to study the stars when he grew up, either as an astronomer or as a man who spent a great deal of time looking at them from mountain tops. Isaac considered this. "Those are two different careers," he said. "I know," Thomas said. "I have not decided which yet." "You have time," Della said. "I'll be 10 in August," Thomas said, as though this narrowed the window considerably. Clara said she intended to study rocks, which had been her intention for 2 years now and showed no sign of changing. Isaac looked at Della over the heads of their children, and his expression was the one she loved best, the one she had been watching for 10 years, the one that had learned to be open where it used to be closed. By 1890, the Bishop Garrity Ranch was one of the more established operations in the region, with a reputation for fair dealing with its hands and sound management. Isaac had brought on additional workers as the herd grew, and he ran the operation in the way he ran everything, with clarity and fairness and the kind of daily consistency that builds trust over time. He hired a young hand that year named Eli Marston, 19 years old and clearly talented with horses, who reminded Isaac uncomfortably of himself at the same age, earnest and skilled, and not quite sure where he was heading. Isaac invested a small amount of extra time in Eli's development, the way Ben Garrity had once invested time in his, and Della watched this and said nothing about it except to make sure there was always extra food on the table when Eli stayed late to help with something, which became a regular occurrence. "You're doing what Ben Garrity did for you," she told Isaac one evening. "I am aware of that," he said. "It's a good thing," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." In the summer of 1891, something happened that Della would think about for the rest of her life as a moment of complete resolution, though she could not have explained exactly why. She was in the mercantile on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the midday heat pressing down, the street outside empty, Thomas and Clara at school, when she found herself alone in the store for the first time in what felt like a long while. She stood behind the counter where she had stood for 13 years, in the store her father had built, looking at the shelves he had put up, and the floor he had laid, and the window that looked out on the main street of Cimarron. She thought about the morning the letter from Gerald Hooper had appeared under the door. She thought about the 60-day window and the fear she had not entirely shown anyone. She thought about October of 1878 and the bell above the door ringing and Isaac Bishop standing in the light. She thought about 6 years of prayers said in the dark for a name she carried without knowing why. She thought about what it meant, all of it, the strange trajectory from that wagon train to this store to this town to this life, the way things that are meant to find each other do, find each other eventually, through whatever combination of grace and coincidence, and the faithful repetition of a name in the dark that keeps two people connected without their knowing. She bowed her head behind the counter, right there in the empty store, and she prayed, as she did every day but this time with the particular fullness of someone accounting for something, someone looking back at the whole of a thing and seeing its shape. She thanked God for Thomas Atwood, who had taught her to pray honestly. She thanked God for Gerald Hooper's terrible letter, without which Isaac Bishop might not have been standing in her doorway that October morning with his hat in his hand. She thanked God for the wagon train and the broken wheel, and a boy of 18 with careful hands and serious eyes. She thanked God for 3 years of prayers said in the dark for a name she had not understood, and for the fact that 3 years of prayers had been said in return without either of them knowing. She thanked God for Isaac Bishop, by name specifically, as always, as she had done almost every evening for 13 years now, only the context so different from where it had started that it was almost a different prayer entirely. Almost, but not quite, because the core of it was the same. A person caring for another person, speaking that care into whatever space exists between the human heart and the one that made it. Isaac came to the mercantile that evening to walk home with her, as he sometimes did on Thursdays when the ranch work ended early enough. He came through the door and she was restocking a shelf, and she turned and looked at him, and she must have had some expression he could read, because he said, "What is it?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything, I was just thinking." He came and stood beside her. "Good thinking, the best kind," she said. "The kind that makes you understand where you are." He put his arm around her shoulders, right there in the mercantile between the flour sacks and the dry goods, and she leaned against him, and the evening light through the front window was the same gold it had always been in the fall. "We should go home," she said. "We should," he agreed. They walked the mile to the house in the cooling evening, the mountains ahead of them turning color, the sound of Thomas and Clara already audible from the yard as they approached, the particular noise of two children who have been in school all day and have arrived home full of things to say and energy to burn. Thomas had learned something about Jupiter's moons and needed to discuss it immediately. Clara had had a disagreement with a girl in her class about the proper identification of a piece of quartz, and she was absolutely certain she had been correct and wanted confirmation. The cat sat on the porch railing, watching all of this with aristocratic detachment. Isaac dealt with Jupiter's moons with his usual full attention, and then sided carefully with Clara on the quartz question on the grounds that Clara's rock collection and study habits were, in his assessment, more reliable than those of whoever the other girl was. Della made supper in the kitchen, listening to the voices from the porch through the open window, Isaac's low and steady, Thomas's increasingly excited as he got deeper into his astronomical explanation, Clara's satisfied now that her expertise had been validated. The ordinary music of her life. She stirred the pot and thought about 16-year-old Della on a wagon train, who had helped repair a wheel and spoken to a quiet boy with careful hands, and had carried his name into the future without knowing she was doing it. She thought about what that girl would have made of this kitchen, this evening, this family. She thought she would have been very glad. The years continued to build, as good years do, each one adding something to the structure of the life rather than diminishing it. In 1892, the Bishop Garrity Ranch became, at Ben Garrity's instigation, the Bishop Ranch, after Ben passed his remaining interest to his sons, who had neither interest in nor aptitude for ranching, and were glad to take a final payment and be done with it. Isaac accepted the full ownership with the gravity that he brought to large things, understanding the weight of it and choosing to be equal to that weight, which was the only way he knew how to do anything. Della marked the occasion by framing the original deed in the parlor, beside the framed photograph of her father that had been there since they moved in. Thomas, who was 12 by then and had the logical mind of someone who was going to be very good at some exacting discipline, asked why she had put those two things next to each other. "Because your grandfather started something," she said, "and your father continued it. Different things, but the same spirit." Thomas considered this. "Is the spirit the important part?" "Yes," Della said, "always." He thought about this seriously for a moment and then said, "Then I should start something too." "You will," she said, "give it time." He did give it time, and what he started, eventually, was the study of the night sky with the rigor of someone who would later be known in the territory as the young man from Cimarron who had built his own astronomical charts from scratch using a telescope Isaac helped him acquire in 1895, and a set of mathematics that he taught himself partly from books and partly from correspondence with a professor in Chicago. But that was later. Clara grew into a girl who knew more about the geology of the New Mexico territory than most adults, and who had the methodical thoroughness of her father applied to the specific world of rocks and land, and whose collection had, by 1893, required its own special shelf in the parlor and her father's diplomatic negotiation with her about what was, and was not appropriate to bring into the kitchen. In 1893, Della became pregnant again, unexpectedly at 37, which was later than she had anticipated for such things but which the midwife assured her was manageable, and which Isaac received with the same careful joy he had received the first 2 times, plus an additional depth of feeling that came from knowing, at 39, exactly what it meant. The baby was born in February of 1894, a boy they named Samuel, robust and loud, and from the first days of his life emphatically his own person, with Della's brown hair and Isaac's expression of settled, serious intent wearing a baby's face. Thomas, 13 and deeply self-possessed about most things, received his new brother with a thoughtfulness that surprised and pleased both parents. He asked Della very seriously if Samuel would also be interested in stars, and Della said she thought it was too early to tell, and Thomas said he would give the matter time. Clara, 10 years old and entirely certain about her priorities, decided that Samuel was an interesting specimen and observed him with scientific attention for about a week before concluding that he was also quite pleasant, and she was glad he was there. Samuel grew the way his siblings had grown, in the particular soil of that household, surrounded by books and honest conversation, and the specific warmth of 2 parents who had chosen each other with full knowledge, and continued to choose each other every day. Isaac turned 40 in 1894, which he approached with the characteristic equanimity he applied to most things, and Della turned 40 in 1896, which she approached with similar calm, and which Isaac marked by giving her a small silver brooch he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe, shaped like a running horse, simple and beautiful, which she wore on her coat collar for the rest of her life. The ranch grew. The mercantile thrived. Thomas went east to study in 1898, which was hard in the way that it is always hard when the first child leaves, and Della stood at the stage depot and watched him go with the composed face of a woman who had decided she would not cry until she was back in her kitchen, which she managed mostly. Isaac's hand was on her back the whole way home. Clara stayed in Cimarron, which Della had not expected or required but which she was quietly glad of, because Clara had decided that the geology of the territory was her life's work, and you did not need to go east to study New Mexico rock, a position that was entirely valid. She taught at the town school while conducting her own systematic cataloging of the local formations, and she was excellent at the teaching, having inherited her mother's patience and her father's clarity. Samuel, the youngest, grew up the most open of the 3, perhaps because he had arrived into a household that was already settled and warm and fully itself, without any of the building tensions of earlier years. He had a sociability his father had never possessed, and a quality of joyful engagement with people that was distinctly his own. And by the time he was 6, he knew every person in Cimarron by name, and they all knew him. In 1899, a week before the year turned, Della was alone in the mercantile in the early morning, before Rosamond arrived, doing the accounts in the quiet she loved. The year was ending and the new century was coming, and she was 53 years old, or would be in the spring, and her husband would be 55, and their son was studying the stars in Chicago, and their daughter was mapping the rocks of New Mexico, and their youngest boy was 5 years old and asleep in the house a mile from town. She looked at the ledger in front of her, and she thought about all the ledgers. The original one she had shown Isaac when he came back as a loan request, the ledger entry they had both signed. The steady accumulation of entries over 20 years of a business her father had started. She thought about Gerald Hooper's letter beneath the door, which had once seemed like the end of something and had turned out to be the beginning of everything. She thought about Isaac Bishop, who was at the ranch at this early hour, probably already in the barn, and who would come to town for supper this evening because it was a Thursday, and who would walk through the door of the mercantile the way he had walked through it the very first time, with the particular quality of stillness she had recognized before she recognized his face. She thought about kneeling beside her bed in this building in the small room upstairs at 22 years old and praying for a man she could barely picture, a name in the dark, and she thought about him doing the same, across the territory under whatever sky he was sleeping under, saying her name in the dark faithfully without knowing she was saying his. Two people in separate places, keeping each other without knowing it. Held together by something that had no visible form and required nothing more than the habit of care, of remembering, of speaking a name into the space between the human heart and whatever listens. She would never fully understand the mechanism of it. She was deeply, completely glad of it. The bell above the door rang and she looked up. Isaac stood in the doorway of Atwood's mercantile, his hat in his hand, the morning light behind him. He had come early today, apparently, and he looked the way he always looked, older than 18 by more than years, steady and direct and entirely himself. "You're early," she said. "I know," he said. He came to the counter. "I wanted to see you." She looked at her husband across the counter where she had looked at him for the first time 21 years ago, and she felt the full length of those years and was glad of every one of them, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones, because they had built the thing she was standing in. "Coffee," she said. "Please," he said. She poured it and he settled on the stool across from her, and outside the morning light was growing over the main street of Cimarron, and the new century was 6 days away, and their children were becoming who they were going to be, and the ranch was running, and the mercantile was sound, and the mountains outside of town were the same mountains they had always been, unmoved and permanent and quietly magnificent. She set the coffee in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "What are you thinking about?" He said the question he always asked. She looked at him. "You," she said, the answer that was always true. He smiled, that smile that had been transforming his face since June of 1879, the one she had never stopped being glad to see. "That is convenient," he said, "because I am thinking about you." "As always," she said. "As always," he agreed. Outside, the last days of 1899 turned quietly in the dry winter air of New Mexico, and inside the mercantile, two people sat across a counter from each other the way they had for more than 20 years, talking and quiet by turns, holding the space they had built together with the easy care of people who know what they have and have chosen, every day since October of 1878, to keep on choosing it. And if you had asked either of them when it had started, they would have said different things, maybe. Isaac might have said October, the morning he walked through the door. Della might have said June of 1879, the picnic and the cottonwood shade. They might both have gone further back and said some evening in the 1870s, kneeling in the dark, speaking a name into the quiet. But perhaps the true beginning was earlier still. A wagon train, 1872. A broken wheel. a boy with careful hands helping a girl and her father in the heat of the day, and at the end of it saying simply that he hoped she found what she was looking for. She had. She very much had. And so, in every way that counted, in every way that mattered in the long accounting of a life, had he.